Rome, 64 AD. The night sky glows orange as flames consume entire neighborhoods. Emperor Nero stands on his palace balcony, watching the city burn. When the people demand answers, he points his finger at a peculiar group of outcasts who worship a crucified Jewish carpenter. Within days, Christians are being sewn into animal skins and thrown to wild dogs. Others are coated in pitch, tied to posts and set ablaze as human torches to light Nero's garden parties. Their screams echo through the marble corridors of power. 300 years later, that same empire bows before the cross. The persecuted have become the powerful. The hunted are now the honored. Temples to Jupiter and Mars stand empty while churches rise from their ruins. It's the most improbable conquest in human history, and it happened without a single sword being drawn in anger, without political power, without wealth, without armies. This is the story of how a ragtag group of fishermen, slaves, and social outcasts toppled the greatest empire the world had ever known. But here's what they never tell you. The early Christians didn't win because they were stronger. They won because they were stranger. So strange that the Romans literally couldn't comprehend what they were witnessing. Let me paint you a picture of what Rome looked like when Christianity first emerged. This wasn't just the most powerful empire in history. It was a civilization that had perfected the art of cultural absorption. For centuries, Rome had conquered nations by conquering their gods. When Roman legions marched into Greece, they didn't destroy the Greek gods. They simply renamed them. Zeus became Jupiter. Aphrodite became Venus. Problem solved. Every culture Rome encountered followed the same playbook. You scratch my god's back, I'll scratch yours. The Romans had a term for this. Interpretatio Romana, the Roman interpretation. It was brilliant, really. Why make enemies when you can make the conquered people feel included? Egyptian merchants in Rome could worship Isis. Syrian soldiers could honor Mithras. Germanic tribes could keep their forest spirits. The Pantheon in Rome housed statues of gods from dozens of cultures. It was the ancient world's version of religious tolerance. And it worked spectacularly well for keeping an empire of 100 million people from falling apart. Then came the Christians, and they broke every rule in the Roman playbook. Picture this. It's the year 112 AD in Bithynia, a prosperous Roman province in modern-day Turkey. The governor, Pliny the Younger, has a problem. He's discovering Christians everywhere, in the markets, in the military, even among the wealthy families. So he does what any sensible Roman official would do. He arrests a few, brings them before the tribunal, and offers them a simple deal. Just burn a pinch of incense to the emperor's statue, he tells them. That's it. You don't even have to mean it. Everyone does it. It's basically just saying the Pledge of Allegiance. The Christians refuse. So Pliny tries again. Look, you can still worship your Christ. We don't care. Just acknowledge the emperor's divine spirit. It's a formality. They refuse again. Pliny is genuinely confused. He writes a letter to Emperor Trajan describing these people as afflicted with a depraved, excessive superstition. He can't understand it. He's not asking them to abandon their god. He's asking them to do what every other culture in the empire does. Make room for one more deity. But to Christians, this wasn't flexibility. It was betrayal. Now, before we go further, let me ask you something. Where are you watching this from right now, and what time is it there? Drop a comment below because I'm genuinely curious about how this story resonates across different parts of the world and different time zones. And if you're finding value in this deep dive into history, consider leaving a super thanks. It really helps keep Professor Archive going and lets us create more content like this. Here's what made Christianity so dangerous to Rome. It wasn't just exclusive, it was aggressively egalitarian. And this is where things get fascinating because the Romans had never encountered anything quite like it. In Roman society, everyone knew their place. The social hierarchy was everything. Senators sat in the front rows at the gladiatorial games. Slaves sat in the back if they were lucky enough to attend at all. At dinner parties, the most important guests reclined closest to the host. Even in worship, the wealthy bought the best access to the gods through expensive sacrifices. The entire civilization was built on layers of status, honor, and social position. Christian gatherings obliterated all of this. In house churches across the empire, a senator might sit next to his own slave, both calling each other brother. Women prayed alongside men, something that would have been scandalous in most Roman religious contexts. A wealthy merchant broke bread with an unemployed laborer. The Apostle Paul, writing around 50 AD, put it plainly, "There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." The Romans didn't just disagree with this, they found it incomprehensible. It violated the fundamental order of the universe as they understood it. The gods themselves were hierarchical. Jupiter ruled over the lesser gods. The emperor was a living god above ordinary mortals. The father had absolute authority in the household, the right of life and death over his children and slaves. This was natural law. This was how the cosmos worked. And then these Christians showed up saying everyone was equal before their God. Not equal in potential, mind you, but equal in dignity right now in this moment. A female slave had the same spiritual worth as the emperor himself. This wasn't just radical, it was revolutionary in the most literal sense. But here's the twist. The Christians didn't organize politically. They didn't form revolutionary cells or plot uprisings. They didn't publish manifestos or lead protest marches. They did something far more subversive. They lived as if their belief was already true. Let me tell you about what happened during the Antonine Plague. Around 165 AD, a devastating epidemic swept through the Roman Empire, possibly smallpox or measles. Modern estimates suggest it killed between 5 and 10 million people, roughly 10% of the entire empire's population. Cities were hit particularly hard. Bodies piled up in the streets because there was no one left to bury them. The standard Roman response to plague was rational by their standards. Abandon the sick and flee. Galen, the empire's most famous physician, literally left Rome to wait out the epidemic in a countryside estate. This wasn't considered cowardly, it was sensible self-preservation. The Roman value system prized the strong, the healthy, the capable. The sick and dying were already lost. Why throw away healthy lives trying to save them? Christians did the opposite. A pagan observer named Dionysius, bishop of Alexandria, later wrote about what he witnessed during a subsequent plague in 260 AD. He described how Christians showed unbounded love and loyalty, never sparing themselves and thinking only of one another. Heedless of danger, they took charge of the sick, attending to their every need and ministering to them in Christ. Meanwhile, he noted, the pagans thrust aside anyone who began to be sick and kept aloof even from their dearest friends, and cast the sufferers out upon the public roads half dead. Here's the kicker. This Christian behavior was epidemiologically effective. Modern studies of disease transmission suggest that even basic nursing care, just giving people water and food when they're too weak to get it themselves, can cut mortality rates in half during these kinds of epidemics. The Christians weren't just performing acts of mercy, they were accidentally conducting public health interventions. More pagans survived in neighborhoods with active Christian communities. People noticed. But it went deeper than just plague response. The everyday operations of the early church were designed, almost unconsciously, to create a parallel social support system that the Roman state couldn't match. The Roman Empire had no social safety net. There was no unemployment insurance, no food stamps, no public health care, no retirement benefits. If you couldn't work, you either had family to support you, or you begged, or you died. The emperors occasionally distributed free grain to prevent riots, but that was about it. Charity, as we understand it, barely existed. The wealthy gave gifts to their social equals or inferiors to demonstrate their status and create obligation, not out of compassion for suffering. Christians systematized charity. In Rome by the mid-3rd century, the church was supporting 1,500 widows and destitute persons daily. This was in addition to feeding orphans, burying the dead, supporting prisoners, and providing ransom money for Christians taken by bandits. The funds came from voluntary contributions, but the distribution was organized. The church appointed deacons specifically to manage this welfare system. It was sophisticated social programming operating beneath the notice of the imperial administration. And here's what the Romans couldn't see. Every person the church helped became a walking advertisement for Christianity. You were a widow in Rome whose husband died in a construction accident. The pagan temples offer you nothing. Your husband's guild might provide some assistance if he was a member, but that's about it. Then Christians show up at your door with food, money, and an invitation to their community. They tell you that you're valued, that their God sees you, that you matter. What choice would you make? This was conquest through care, evangelism through acts of service. The Christian writer Tertullian, writing around 197 AD, quoted what pagans said about Christians. See how they love one another. He meant it as a compliment to his fellow believers, but was also an acknowledgement of Christianity's primary weapon. Conspicuous compassion on a scale the Roman world had never witnessed. Now, let's talk about martyrdom, because this is where the story gets really psychologically complex. The Romans thought that executing Christians would solve their problem. Instead, it made the problem exponentially worse. Think about this from the Roman perspective. You're a provincial governor. You've identified a group that refuses to participate in the civic religion, which is basically treason, since honoring the emperor is a citizenship duty. You have the authority to execute them. You do so publicly to deter others. This is standard operating procedure. It's worked for centuries on bandits, rebels, and troublemakers of all kinds. But Christians responded to execution completely differently than any other group. They didn't resist. They didn't plead for mercy. Many actively sought martyrdom. When Perpetua, a young noblewoman, was arrested in Carthage in 203 AD, her father begged her to renounce Christianity for the sake of her infant son. She refused. In her diary, one of the few surviving first-hand accounts from an early Christian, she described her martyrdom as her birthday, the day she would be born into eternal life. At the arena, she was gored by a wild cow and then stabbed by a gladiator. According to witnesses, she guided the sword to her throat when the gladiator's hand shook. The Roman spectators had come to see criminals die. That was the point of public execution. Demonstrate the power of Rome and the price of defiance. Instead, they witnessed something that looked like victory. The martyrs sang hymns. They comforted each other. They died with smiles on their faces, confident they were going to paradise. Some accounts describe martyrs actually thanking the judges who sentenced them to death because they were providing a shortcut to heaven. Tertullian famously wrote, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church." He wasn't being poetic. He was describing an observable phenomenon. Every public execution drew crowds. Every crowd contained people who were moved, who wondered what could make someone face death with such confidence. The philosopher Origen, writing in the 3rd century, noted that martyrdoms led to no small number of people, contemptuous of death, devoted themselves to the word of Christ. But let's be clear, not all Christians sought martyrdom. The church actually had to create rules against it because some believers were essentially committing suicide by provoking authorities. The mainstream Christian position was that martyrdom was glorious if it came to you, but you shouldn't seek it out. What matters is that the mere existence of people willing to die peacefully for their faith created a powerful psychological impression. And the Romans couldn't stop creating martyrs without abandoning law and order entirely. Think about the trap they were in. If they didn't enforce the laws requiring imperial worship, they looked weak and set a precedent for lawlessness. If they did enforce the laws, they created more martyrs, which generated more sympathy, which led to more conversions. They were locked in a negative feedback loop of their own creation. By the 3rd century, Christianity had penetrated every level of Roman society. And this is where the story gets truly fascinating because the conversion of the empire didn't happen in a single moment. It happened through 1,000 tiny accommodations, compromises, and transformations on both sides. Christian theology itself evolved in dialogue with Roman philosophy. Early Christian thinkers like Justin Martyr and Clement of Alexandria argued that Greek philosophy had prepared the way for Christian truth. They reframed Christianity not as a rejection of classical learning, but as its fulfillment. This made Christianity intellectually respectable to educated Romans, who might otherwise have dismissed it as a superstition for the lower classes. At the same time, Christianity was quietly colonizing Roman cultural forms. Christians started using the basilica, a Roman public building type, as the model for churches. They adopted the organizational structure of Roman provinces for church administration, creating dioceses and parishes. Latin became the language of the Western Church. In 100 small ways, Christianity became Romanized, even as it was converting Romans. Then came Constantine. In 312 AD, on the night before the Battle of Milvian Bridge, Constantine claimed to have seen a vision of the Christian cross in the sky with the words, "In this sign, conquer." Whether or not you believe in the vision, the political calculation was brilliant. Constantine was one of 4 men fighting for control of the empire. He needed an edge. Christianity gave him one. Think about the mathematics of Constantine's decision. By the early 4th century, Christians probably made up somewhere between 5 and 10% of the empire's population. That doesn't sound like much, but they were disproportionately urban, literate, organized, and spread across every province. They had a command structure through their bishops. They had resources through their charity funds. They had motivated adherents willing to die for their cause. In a civil war, that's not just a religious group, that's a potential political coalition. Constantine legalized Christianity with the Edict of Milan in 313 AD. He didn't make it the official religion. That came later under Theodosius in 380 AD. But he gave Christianity imperial favor. He returned confiscated property. He exempted clergy from certain taxes. He built churches, including the original St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. He presided over the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, where bishops from across the empire hammered out official Christian doctrine. Here's the historical irony. Constantine's conversion is often portrayed as the moment Christianity won. In another sense, it was the moment Christianity fundamentally changed. The religion of the persecuted became the religion of the persecutors. Christians who had once been fed to lions now had the power to close pagan temples. The church that had survived through voluntary contributions now had access to imperial treasury funds. Bishops who had hidden from soldiers now advised emperors. Some Christians saw this as providential. God had finally given his church the power to build his kingdom on earth. Others saw it as a catastrophic compromise. The monastic movement, the rush of believers into the desert to live as hermits and ascetics, took off in the 4th century partly as a reaction to the mainstreaming of Christianity. If everyone was Christian now, how could you prove you were serious? By abandoning civilization altogether and wrestling with demons in the Egyptian desert. But we need to zoom out and ask, why did this particular religion succeed when so many others failed? Because the Roman world wasn't short on new religious movements. The 2nd and 3rd centuries were awash in mystery cults, philosophical schools, and exotic imports from the East. Mithraism was popular in the military. The worship of Isis spread from Egypt across the Mediterranean. Neoplatonism attracted intellectuals. Why did Christianity outcompete them all? First, Christianity offered cosmic drama with personal stakes. You weren't just making sacrifices to appease distant, capricious gods. You were part of a grand narrative of creation, fall, redemption, and coming judgment. History had a direction. Your life had meaning within that direction. The story included everyone, from emperor to slave, and gave everyone a role. Second, Christianity provided community in a world of strangers. The Roman Empire was highly mobile. People moved to cities for work. Soldiers were stationed far from home. Merchants traveled trade routes across the Mediterranean. Traditional religions were tied to specific places and peoples. If you left your hometown, you left your gods behind. Christianity was portable. A Christian traveling from Antioch to Rome could show up at the local church with a letter of introduction and be welcomed as family. That network was invaluable. Third, Christianity had answers for suffering that other religions couldn't match. The traditional pagan view was that suffering was simply bad luck, punishment from the gods, or the result of fate. Christianity said suffering had meaning. Jesus himself had suffered. Pain could be redemptive. The poor, the sick, the broken weren't just unlucky, they were blessed. "Blessed are the poor," Jesus had said. "Blessed are those who mourn." In a world where most people suffered, this was revolutionary theology. Fourth, Christianity was exclusive in a way that bred commitment. You couldn't be a half-hearted Christian. You were in or out. You couldn't hedge your bets with multiple gods. This exclusivity created high barriers to entry, but it also created high levels of commitment once you entered. Sociological research on modern religious movements shows that strict religious groups often grow faster than lenient ones because they generate stronger community bonds and more dedicated members. Early Christianity fit this pattern perfectly. Fifth, Christianity had a sophisticated intellectual tradition that could engage with classical philosophy while maintaining its distinct identity. This let it appeal to both the educated elite and the illiterate masses, something few other movements managed. And sixth, perhaps most importantly, Christianity practiced what it preached to a degree that impressed even its critics. The gap between Christian ideals and Christian practice was narrower than the gap in almost any other ancient movement. Not zero, obviously. Christian hypocrisy existed from day one, as any honest reading of Paul's letters reveals. But the median Christian behavior, especially regarding care for the poor and sick, exceeded the median pagan behavior by enough to be noticeable. By the end of the 4th century, the transformation was complete. The Emperor Theodosius I made Christianity the official religion of the empire in 380 AD. Pagan temples were closed. Pagan sacrifices were banned. The altar of victory, which had stood in the Roman Senate since Augustus, was removed. The Olympic Games, held for over 1,000 years, were discontinued because of their pagan associations. In Alexandria, Christian mobs destroyed the great temple of Serapis, one of the wonders of the ancient world. The conquered had become conquerors. But here's what haunts this story. Did Christianity conquer Rome, or did Rome conquer Christianity? The religion that emerged from the 4th century looked very different from the movement described in the book of Acts. It had hierarchies, properties, political power, and the ability to persecute its own dissidents. Was this the inevitable evolution of a successful movement, or a betrayal of its origins? There's no easy answer, but the question itself reveals something important. The early Christians succeeded not because they compromised with power, but because they built an alternative to it. They created communities of mutual aid. They valued people the empire considered worthless. They faced death with confidence. They answered the deepest questions of meaning and suffering. They demonstrated a different way of being human. Once Christianity gained imperial backing, it kept growing, but for different reasons. Now it spread through political pressure, cultural expectation, and the slow grinding force of institutional power. That's still conquest, but it's a very different kind of conquest than what happened in the first 3 centuries. The truly remarkable period was those 3 centuries of growth without power. A movement that began with a handful of terrified disciples in Jerusalem grew to encompass millions across 3 continents without ever controlling an army, a province, or a government. They had no media network, no advertising budget, no political party. What they had was a compelling story, a supportive community, and a willingness to live and die for what they believed. And maybe that's the real lesson of the Forgotten Revolution. Power, whether we're talking about the 1st century or the 21st century, comes in many forms. The most obvious form is the sword, the throne, the empire. That's the kind of power everyone recognizes and most people want. But there's another kind of power, the power of an idea whose time has come, the power of a community that genuinely cares for its members, the power of people willing to sacrifice for something larger than themselves. The early Christians understood, perhaps accidentally, that this second kind of power is ultimately stronger than the first. You can resist an army. You can plot against an emperor. But how do you fight people who respond to persecution with forgiveness, who face death with joy, who treat your slaves like family, who nurse you through plagues when your own relatives have abandoned you? The Roman Empire had the most powerful military in the world. It had wealth beyond measure. It had 1,000 years of institutional knowledge about how to control populations. and it lost to a group of people whose primary weapon was love, expressed through action. That's not theology, that's just historical fact. The nature of that love, its source, its meaning, those are questions every person has to answer for themselves. But the impact of that love on the course of human history is undeniable. So here's my question for you. What profession or background do you come from? And how does this story land for you? Does it challenge your assumptions about how power works in the world? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them all, and these conversations are often as enlightening as the research itself. The Forgotten Revolution reminds us that the most profound changes in human civilization don't always come from the top down. Sometimes they come from the bottom up, from the margins, from the people everyone else underestimates. The Roman emperors thought they could crush Christianity anytime they wanted. They were right about their power, but wrong about its limits. You can kill people, but you can't kill an idea whose time has come. You can ban a movement, but you can't ban the human longing for meaning, community, and hope. In the end, Rome didn't fall to Christianity in any military sense. Rome fell to its own internal contradictions, economic problems, and barbarian invasions. But by the time Rome fell, Christianity had already built something new on its foundations. The bishops stepped into the vacuum left by collapsing civic administration. The church became the keeper of literacy and learning through the Dark Ages. Monasteries preserved classical texts. Christian networks maintained some semblance of civilization as the empire fragmented. You could argue that Christianity didn't destroy Rome, it transformed it. The Roman Empire fell, but a Christian Roman civilization continued for another 1,000 years in Byzantium. And in the West, after the chaos of the 5th and 6th centuries, a new civilization emerged that blended Germanic tribalism, Roman law, and Christian theology into something the ancient world would never have recognized, but that shaped everything that came after. This is Professor Archive, reminding you that history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about ideas, movements, and ordinary people who changed the world in extraordinary ways. The story of early Christianity is fundamentally the story of how a small group of committed people, armed with nothing but their convictions and their willingness to love, conquered the unconquerable. If this deep dive into the past has given you something to think about, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future episodes. And if you really want to support what we're doing here at Professor Archive, consider leaving a super thanks. It makes a genuine difference in our ability to keep producing content like this. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember, the revolutionaries aren't always the ones holding the weapons. Sometimes they're the ones willing to lay them down.